Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf. We begin at the bottom of the Daf Samach Tes, where there is a Mishnah that introduces the topic of the Korban Chagiga that was brought on Erev Pesach. The Mishnah will state a few halachos. The Gemara will bring the Tana by the name of Ben Tema, who disagrees. The Gemara will discuss how far Ben Tema's opinion really goes. And the Gemara will bring another Tana who set himself apart from the Klal, and he did not agree with the Psak. The Gemara will try to show his source, and the Gemara will have some questions on that. So first of all, by way of introduction, there are two Korban Chagigas relevant to Pesach, and a third carbon besides for the Korban Pesach itself. That means we have a total of 4 karbanos we are discussing. The Korban Pesach is brought on Erev Pesach, and it has all the special halachos of the Korban Pesach that we're discussing in this Masechta. Then there's a Korban Chagiga, which is a standard Korban Chagiga. It's a regular carbon that's brought on every Yom Tov. It's supposed to be brought on the first day of Yom Tov, which, in far as Pesach is concerned, would be the 15th of Nisan, not the 14th. If one forgets to bring it, one is allowed to bring it for the rest of Yom Tov. Then there's a third carbon, which is called Shalmi Simcha. It's a special carbon which is brought to add Simcha. It fulfills the mitzvah of V'samachta v'chagecha. That's brought on Yom Tov as well. That's only referred to obliquely in this daf. It doesn't come up much. But what the daf is mainly focused on is a fourth carbon, and that's the Korban Chagiga that comes on Erev Pesach. Not to be confused with the standard Korban Chagiga of every Yom Tov, which comes on the first day of Yom Tov. On Erev Pesach, there is a potential Korban Chagiga which comes together with the Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach, and that's what this Mishnah is about. And this Mishnah says that this Korban Chagiga is different than the standard Korban Chagiga of Yom Tov. This Korban Chagiga is similar to the Korban Pesach, but it's different in several ways. The Mishnah tells us how it's different. It's different in the following 3 ways. Number one, you can bring it on Shabbos, you can bring it if people are tamei, and you can bring it if there is enough food in the Korban Pesach to feed all the people in the group. The Gemara explains the reason for the Korban Chagiga that comes with the Pesach is that we want people to be close to being full when they eat the Korban Pesach. They want the Korban Pesach to not be something that you're eating because of hunger, but something that you're eating because of the mitzvah, and it's bringing you to a state of fullness so that you're enjoying the eating. It's a real eating. It's not a filling up. It's not an overstuffed. Therefore, we have a Korban Chagiga that you're supposed to eat beforehand, and then the Korban Pesach itself. If the Korban Pesach has enough meat, you have a very small number of people registered to it, has enough meat for people to actually eat, and then still have another concise that they could eat while they're reasonably close to being full, then you would not need a Korban Chagiga. You wouldn't bring it. Again, also we said it's not Derech Shabbos, and you can bring it if the majority of the tzibur is tamei, while the Korban Pesach could be brought. Those 3 halachos are one way in which the Korban Chagiga is different than the Korban Pesach, even though they're both on Erev Pesach. The other 2 ways are as far as what type of animal you're allowed to bring and when you're allowed to eat it. As far as what type of animal, the Korban Pesach is only allowed to be a male goat or sheep, and the Korban Chagiga could also be a cow, and it could also be a female. As far as when you're supposed to eat it, the Korban Pesach has to be finished by morning. The Torah explicitly says you're not allowed to leave it over past the night, while the Korban Chagiga, you get another day subsequent. You can eat it for the entire night of the 14th into the 15th, and you can eat it the entire 15th. Now, the Gemara asks, what is this Mishnah doing here? The previous Mishnah was discussing Korban Pesach. The next Mishnah is discussing Korban Pesach. Why are you interrupting with Korban Chagiga? So Gemara says, because the last Mishnah was discussing things you're not allowed to do on Shabbos for the Korban Pesach, and here we're pointing out that you're not allowed to bring this Korban Chagiga on Shabbos. It's connected because they're both things which you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. The Gemara then also explains that this Korban Chagiga is not obligatory. It's not like the standard Korban Chagiga for Yom Tov, which is an obligation. This one is not obligatory, and the proof of that is that you don't bring it if you have enough meat in the Korban Pesach. You don't bring it on Shabbos, and you don't bring it if the majority of the congregation is tamei. The Gemara also explains the purpose of it, so that you should be full. Okay, now the Gemara points out that our Mishnah doesn't fit with the Tana named Ben Tema. Ben Tema holds that the Korban Chagiga that comes together with the Korban Pesach is very closely similar to the Korban Pesach itself, and it we have at first at least one halacha, and that is he holds that the carbon chagiga also has to be finished being eaten by the end of the night. It cannot be eaten on the day of the 15th at all. The Brisa of Ben Tema also adds another halacha. It adds the halacha which the Gemara will not follow up on. The halacha is that if you are makdish an animal to be the carbon chagiga that comes on Erev Pesach and you don't end up using it. Alright, let's say you were makdish because you thought you weren't going to have enough meat, and then it ended up that you had enough meat, some people left your chabura, whatever it is, and therefore you had plenty of meat. So you did not end up bringing the carbon chagiga on Erev Pesach at all. So the Gemara says that you're not allowed to use it for the carbon chagiga of Yom Tov, but you are allowed to use it for the Shalmi Simcha. What's the difference? So generally the rule is that something which is hektish already cannot be used for a carbon chova, an obligatory carbon, something that you're obligated to bring. You have to bring it from something which is yours, which is not hektish yet, but something else that you are makdish for a different purpose, you can bring it. As far as Shalmi Simcha goes, though, we have a special drasha that exempts it from that rule, and therefore the Shalmi Simcha carbon, you are allowed to bring this carbon chagiga that you are makdish already. However, the carbon chagiga of Yom Tov, you can't bring it. Okay, so now the Gemara goes more deeply into the halacha of Ben Tema. Ben Tema, the Gemara wants to know what is the source of his halacha that the carbon chagiga is also not allowed to be this is again the chagiga of Erev Pesach is also limited to that night and cannot be eaten the next day. So Gemara says his drush is from the pasuk describing the limitations of the times of the eating of the carbon Pesach, and it says as follows: "V'lo yolin labaker," you shouldn't leave over till the morning. Zevach chag haPesach. That translates to the carbon of the Yom Tov, the Pesach. So the Gemara says that he separates these words into two things. Zeva Chag is referring to the carbon Chagiga. Pesach is referring to the carbon Pesach. And both of these are put together in the halacha of Lina. You cannot leave it over until the morning. So now the Gemara asks, how far does this connection between the two go? Is it only that it applies to this pasuk and it's talking about the Lina leaving over, or does it also apply to the halacha of eating the carbon? The other halacha of eating, which is that it has to be roasted. So we know that the carbon pesach has to be roasted. Does that also apply to the carbon chagiga that's brought together with it, according to Ben Tema? So Gemara quotes a brisa that says halayla zakul etzli. Brisa says everything that's eaten on the night of Pesach has to be roasted, and Rav Chizah said that that's Ben Tema. So you see, yes, that halacha is common to both carbon pesach and the carbon chagiga of the 14th. The Gemara now asks, okay, that's an eating halacha. What about the other halachos as far as what type of animal you're allowed to bring? What about the fact that the carbon Pesach cannot be cattle, can't be female, and can't be 2 years old? Does that apply to a carbon chagiga? So the Gemara quotes another brisa which discusses those three halachos and discusses the fourth halacha that it has to be eaten by the people who are registered to it specifically. And this brisa says that all these halachos apply both to the carbon Pesach and to the carbon chagiga that comes together with the carbon Pesach. And the verse says again, it has to be Ben Tema is the only one who we know he holds of this halacha that it has to be together. Okay, the Gemara now moves on to discuss the next halacha, and that is the halacha of shiras etzem. You're not allowed to break the bones of the carbon Pesach. Are you allowed to break the bones of the carbon chagiga that comes together with it? The Gemara goes into a Mishnah which discusses the halacha of tumah of the knife, and that's going to be a lengthy discussion which will bring us to a proof as to whether or not you're allowed to break the bones of the carbon chagiga. The sugya is about what happens if you find a knife on Erev Pesach or close to Pesach and you want to know if you can use it. The issue is can you assume that it was put in the mikvah and that it's not a tameh? Now, a knife which you put in the mikvah does not become tar until the sun goes down. So it's got to be put in the mikvah the day before you need it. It's not going to become tar on the day you put it in the mikvah itself. So therefore, the Mishnah says the rule is that you could assume, if you find a knife, you could assume that the owner put it in the mikvah the day before he needs it. Therefore, the halacha is if you find the knife on the day that you need it, you could assume it was put in the mikvah because the owner wanted to use it today, so therefore he must have put it in the mikvah yesterday. If, however, you find it the day before you need it, then you can't assume it was put in the mikvah yet because the owner could have put it today, but maybe he lost it before he got a chance to put it in the mikvah, and therefore you have to go put it in the mikvah yourself. Now, there are two types of knives. There's a shechita knife, and then there's a hakmeser, what the Gemara calls a kupitz. It's a knife which could technically be used for shechita, but it's generally used to chop up the bones. So the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, which says halacha as follows: you find the shechita knife. So if you found it on the 14th day of Nisan, it's supposed to be used today. It was definitely put in the mikveh yesterday. You don't have to tevel it again, because the owner, if he wanted to use it, he brought it in order to use it, and he must have put it in the mikveh on Yud Gimel. If, however, you find a hackmaster, you find a chopping knife, so that the halacha is that it doesn't make a difference whether you found it on the 13th or on the 14th. You have to put it in the mikveh again. Why? Because it's not going to be used until the 15th. Because you can't use the knife to chop up the Korban Pesach. You can only use it to chop up the Korban Chagiga. And this Mishnah is ignoring the Korban Chagiga of Pesach, of Erev Pesach, and it's talking about the Korban Chagiga of Yontif itself, which comes on the 15th. If you're not going to need this hackmaster until the 15th, and therefore you didn't put it in the mikveh yet necessarily, if you find it on the 14th, it was not put in the mikveh yet, and you have to go put it in the mikveh itself. The Gemara says, obviously, the fact that we're ignoring the Korban Chagiga that's brought on Erev Pesach, we're holding that the Korban Chagiga on Erev Pesach, you couldn't break the bones. That's why we should assume that the owner wasn't planning on using this knife until the 15th. If you could break the bones of the carbon on the 14th, so then you should assume that he's planning on using the hackmaster on the 14th, and if you find it on the 14th, it was already put in the mikvah on the 13th, in order that should be tahar for use to break the bones on the 14th. Granted, you can't break the bones of the Korban Pesach, but you could break the bones of the Korban Chagiga. Must be the author of this brisa holds that you are not allowed to break the bones of the Korban Chagiga that comes in Erev Pesach either, and that must be Ben Tema, and it proves that he holds that in that way it's similar to Korban Pesach as well. So Gemara answers, not necessarily. It could be we're talking about a situation where there is no Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach. There is no Korban Chagiga. There is no Korban Chagiga that's coming on Erev Pesach. We learned that there's a number of reasons why that might be. That there won't be a Korban Chagiga brought on Erev Pesach, and therefore the only Korban Chagiga in this situation is on the 15th, and that's why if you find the knife on the 14th, it has to go in the mikveh because it couldn't be used on the 14th, and therefore he was only planning on using it on the 15th, and he only put it in the mikveh. He was only planning on putting it in the mikveh on the 14th, but it could be he lost it before he got a chance to put it in the mikveh. So the Gemara says, what is the situation that you're claiming exists here in which there was no Korban Pesach but on the 14th? So the Gemara says, well, first of all, maybe the 14th was a Shabbos. The Gemara says, that can't be, because this next part of the brisa tells us that there's a different halacha if the 14th comes out on a Shabbos. That part of the brisa says, if the 14th comes out on a Shabbos, the halacha is that you don't have to put it in the mikveh. Not only that, but if you find it on the 15th, you're also allowed to use it, and you don't have to put it in the mikveh. Why? Because since the 14th is a Shabbos, you weren't allowed to put it in the mikveh on a Shabbos, and you certainly wanted to use it for the Korban Chagiga that's brought on the 15th, the regular Yom Tov Chagiga, but you couldn't put it in the mikveh on the 15th because it wouldn't be tahar. You couldn't put it in the mikveh on Shabbos because you're not allowed to be matbil, you're not allowed to be matahar kelim on Shabbos. It's a type of tikkun. Obviously, you did it on the 13th. Did it on the 13th, you're allowed to use this knife now. You could use it to shecht, you could use it for whatever you want. So here you see that there's a different halacha. It's not the same as halacha we said before. Before we said if you find the knife on the 14th, it has to go in the mikveh. Here we're saying you find it on the 14th, it doesn't have to go in the mikveh because it was certainly titled on the 13th. So obviously the first half, which we are discussing, is not talking about where it was a Shabbos. The Gemara says, okay, fine, no problem. I'll tell you a different reason that there's no Korban Chagiga here. It's because the guy is bringing a Korban Pesach with very few registrants, and therefore there's a lot of meat for everybody. The Gemara says, yeah, but how does he know that? At the time that he's taking his kalim to the mikvah, he doesn't know how many people he's going to have signed up. People keep signing up. So maybe he's going to end up with a lot of people signing up, and therefore he's going to have to bring a Korban Chagiga, and he's going to need the hackmaster to be tahar on the 14th. According to what you're claiming that this Tana agrees that you're allowed to break the bones on the 14th. So he should then put it in the mikvah on the 13th. When it's time, when he's doing his tefillah, he doesn't know whether he's going to be bringing a chagig or not, and he doesn't know whether he's going to therefore be needing the hakmaster or not. So therefore, that can be the explanation here. So Gemara says, okay, so I'll tell you another explanation. We're talking about where everybody was tamei, and therefore they couldn't bring the korban chagig on the 14th, and that's why he knew that he wasn't going to need the hak meser on the 14th, but really he would be able to break the bones had he been breaking it. The Gemara says, but again, how did he know on the 13th that everybody was going to be tamei on the 14th? Where did that situation exist? So the Gemara says, it's simple. The leader of the generation had died, and therefore everybody was going to go to the funeral, and everybody was going to become tamei, and that's how he knew. The Gemara says, 1 second, but he died when? If he died on the 13th, then why is he taking any of his knives to the mikvah? He's allowed to bring the korban pesach betuma. If everybody's going to be tamei, you don't need a tahar knife. Everybody's going to be tamei anyway. What's the point in putting the shechita knife in the mikvah? Remember, this brisa was also discussing the halacha of the shechita knife. Now Rashi points out that the guy who found it, what's his problem? Why does he need it to be tahar, that he has all these halachas, whether or not he could assume it's tahar or not? And Rashi says because he wasn't one of the tamei people, and he was tahar. Everybody else was tamei, but he was tahar. Or at least the majority were tamei. So he knew that he has to bring his korban b'tahara. So he had to have a tahar knife. So Gemara says, so it couldn't be that he died on the 13th, because then you wouldn't need the shechita knife to be tahar. So it's got to be that he died on the 14th. Well, if he died on the 14th, then at the time he was doing tefillas kalim on the 13th, he didn't know yet that the tzibur was going to be tamei. So we're back to our question. He should have had to tevel both the shechita knife and the hak meser, just in case he needs it. As a matter of fact, he should assume that he's going to need it. So Gemara therefore says, talking about a situation where the leader of the generation was very sick and he looked like he was going to go at any moment on the 13th. Now, therefore, the guy said the following thing. He said, look, the shechita knife, I may need to be tahar if the leader of the generation survives, and therefore everybody's going to be tahar. I may not need it. It's a suffix. I will put it in the mikvah misafik. However, the hak meser he's only going to need if there's a korban chagiga and everybody is tahar. So he says, you know what? It's a double suffix. First of all, the guy might die and everybody will be tamei. Second of all, I may have a small number of people signing up for my korban and then I won't need a korban chagiga. A double suffix, I'm not going to put my hak meser in the mikvah for a double suffix. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to discuss another chacham who disagreed with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said that you can't bring the korban chagiga on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda ben Dortai held that you could. And therefore, he didn't want to bring a korban pesach at all because he wanted to bring the chagiga with it, and he wanted to bring it on Shabbos. So, in order to avoid being put in a situation where he was not allowed to bring the korban chagiga that he felt he was supposed to bring, he would go and live in the far south, so that he was b'derech or he was too far away to bring the korban pesach at all, and he couldn't be part of it. And he said, I don't understand it. There's two gedolei hadar, Shmai and Avatalion. A great Talmid Chachamim and speakers. They darshan a lot. But they don't teach Klal Yisrael you're supposed to bring the korban chagiga even on Shabbos. The Gemara says, what is the reasoning of Ben Dortai? What it says is, Joshua the pasuk says, "V'zavach the Pesach Hashem lekach tzayinu bakar." You should shech the korban to Hashem, the korban Pesach to Hashem, sheep and cows. Well, you can't bring a korban Pesach, can't be a cow. So why does it say tzayinu bakar? It's coming to tell you that the tzayin refers to the korban Pesach, bakar, cow, that refers to the korban chagiga, and it's telling you to bring it. Obviously, it's telling you to bring it even on Shabbos. So Gemara says, why are we busy trying to come up with an explanation for somebody who is pirish, who separates himself and goes far away? We don't have to explain him. He's he's beyond the pale. This pasuk is used for something else. Used for a drasha that Rav Nachman said in Rabbi Baravua. This is to teach me that a korban Pesach that wasn't used, she explains, either was lost and it was replaced with a different one and then it was found, or money was set aside to buy a korban Pesach and the price of sheep went down, and therefore you have extra money that has kedushas korban Pesach on it. So what do you do with this extra sheep or extra money? You bring it as a korban shlamim. Korban Pesach that's not used reverts to a shlamim. How do you know? Same pasuk, same drasha. It says min habakar, but you can't bring a cow as a korban Pesach. It means to say that the leftover Pesach should be used as a shlamim, which could be brought from a cow. Because the Gemara says, okay, fine. What is our reasoning? How come we hold that a korban chagiga can't be brought on Shabbos? Cannot be brought on Shabbos. So the Gemara says because in the pasuk describing the korban chagiga on Sukkos, it says, you should Chagoyse Meiser Chag Hashem means you should bring a Chagiga Shivas Yamim. There are 7 days in which you could bring the carbon Chagiga. You're supposed to bring it on the first day. If not, you could bring it all 7. Gemara says, well, what do you mean? Sukkot is 8 days. 7 days of Sukkot and 1 day of Shemini Atzeres. So obviously 1 day is cut off. Why is 1 day cut off? That's Shabbos. Shabbos you can't bring the carbon Chagiga. So Gemara says, Ravin came and he asked, if that's the case, then you should only say 6 days, because sometimes it's only 6 days. If Shabbos is the first day, it'll also be the last day. You'll have 2 days Shabbos, and therefore you can only bring it the other 6. So Abaye was upset with this. Abaye said, no. The pasuk shouldn't. If you could bring it all 8 days, the pasuk should have said 8 days. If you usually have only 7 days to bring it, if you never have 8 days, and you usually have only 7, it makes sense that the Torah will say 7. 6, sometimes it'll happen, it'll be only 6, but still it makes sense for the Torah to say 7 days.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.